There is a pattern hidden inside every toxic relationship, every draining friendship, every dynamic where you constantly feel misunderstood. And once you see it, you will never unsee it. Most people spend years of their life explaining themselves, justifying their decisions, defending their silence, trying to make certain people understand them. And here is the painful truth that nobody warns you about. Some people are not confused about who you are. They have already decided. And every explanation you give them is not changing their mind. It is giving them more ammunition. Today I want to show you exactly who these people are, how to recognize them, and why the moment you stop explaining yourself to them is the moment your life begins to change. Think about the last time you tried to explain yourself to someone. Maybe it was a family member who questioned your choices, a friend who went quiet after you set a boundary, a partner who twisted your words no matter how carefully you chose them, a colleague who always seemed to misread your intentions. You went over it in your head before the conversation. You prepared. You chose the right words. You stayed calm. You were honest. And somehow, at the end of it, you felt worse than before. Not understood. Not seen, just drained. You walked away wondering what you did wrong, what you could have said differently, how to make them finally get it. I want to tell you something important. You did not fail the conversation. The conversation was designed to fail you. Because there is a specific type of person, and psychology has studied them deeply, for whom your explanation is never the point. But your clarity is never the goal. Your peace is never the outcome they are building toward. And until you learn to recognize them, you will keep handing your energy to people who were never going to honor it. Here is what most people do not understand about human behavior. The human mind has two very different modes of listening. The first mode is genuine curiosity. This is when someone truly does not understand you and wants to. They ask questions to learn. They listen to update their perception. When you explain yourself to someone in this mode, connection happens. Understanding grows. The relationship deepens. But there is a second mode. Psychology calls it confirmatory processing. And it works like this. Certain people have already formed a fixed belief about you, about your motives, about your character, about who you are. And when you speak to them, they are not actually listening to understand. They are listening to confirm. Every word you say is being filtered through a conclusion they already reached. Explain that you needed space, and they hear rejection. Explain that you were busy, and they hear an excuse. Explain your boundaries, and they hear selfishness. Explain your silence, and they hear guilt. It does not matter how clearly you speak, because the problem was never your communication. The problem is that they stopped being curious about you a long time ago. And here is what that means for you practically. Every time you explain yourself to this type of person, you are not building a bridge. You are building their case against you. You are handing them more material to misinterpret, more words to take out of context, more proof of whatever story they have already decided to tell about you. Silence reveals everything. The moment you stop explaining, the dynamic shifts. The pressure they place on you loses its grip, and who they really are begins to show itself clearly. But how do you know who these people are? How do you recognize them before you have already spent 3 hours defending yourself in a conversation that left you hollow? That is exactly what I'm going to show you now. Because there are specific signs, specific patterns of behavior. And once you learn them, you will recognize these people within the first few minutes of any conversation. You will notice this immediately once you know what to look for. There is a difference between a question asked in curiosity and a question asked as a trap. Genuine questions have space inside them. Teach space for your answer. Space for something unexpected. The person asking them is open to being surprised by what you say, but certain people ask questions that already contain the answer they want. Why do you always make everything about yourself? Why can't you just be normal about this? So you're saying you don't care about anyone else? Notice what is happening there. The question is not really asking. It is accusing. It is framing. It is pushing you into a corner, where any answer you give sounds like a confession. I once knew a man, I will call him Tariq, brilliant, quiet, deeply thoughtful. He was in a friendship for 6 years with someone who constantly questioned his intentions. Every decision Tariq made became a subject of interrogation. Why did you say it like that? What did you really mean by that? Are you sure that's your reason? Tariq spent years refining his explanations, getting more precise, more careful, more detailed, and the questions never stopped, because they were never designed to be answered. They were designed to keep him explaining, to keep him off balance, to keep him in a position where he felt perpetually guilty for something he could never quite name. The moment Tariq stopped answering those questions, stopped justifying, stopped elaborating, something interesting happened. The friendship ended. And Tariq told me later that the ending felt like breathing for the first time in years. Silence reveals everything. When someone's questions are designed to trap you rather than understand you, your explanation is not the solution. Your silence is. This one is deeply painful, and it is one of the clearest signs that you are dealing with someone you should never explain yourself to. Think about this carefully. There is a sacred thing that happens when you open up to someone, when you share your fears, your insecurities, your past wounds, your soft places. That kind of sharing requires trust. It requires the belief that what you say will be held carefully. But certain people treat your vulnerability like a database. They listen. They nod. They seem to understand in the moment. And then, weeks later, months later, in the middle of an argument or a difficult conversation, they reach into that database and pull something out. Well, you've always had trouble with trust because of what happened with your father. This is just your abandonment issues showing up again. You told me yourself that you can't handle confrontation. Do you feel that? That cold feeling? That is your vulnerability being weaponized, being turned from something you shared in trust into something being used to dismiss you, destabilize you, or win an argument. Psychology has a name for this pattern. It is called using disclosure as leverage. And it is one of the most sophisticated forms of emotional manipulation, precisely because it hides behind the appearance of knowing you. A woman once told me about a relationship she had been in for 4 years. She said the most painful part was not the arguments. Why, it was realizing that every personal thing she had ever shared with this person had been quietly cataloged. And in moments of conflict, those private confessions became weapons. She said, "I stopped knowing what was safe to say. So eventually, I stopped saying anything at all." That silence, she found, wasn't defeat. It was wisdom. If someone has ever used what you shared in a vulnerable moment against you in a heated moment, you are not dealing with someone who deserves your explanations. You are dealing with someone who has shown you exactly how they process your honesty. Believe them. Silence reveals everything. This sign is subtle, and it is the one that confuses the most people, because on the surface, these individuals seem emotionally intelligent. They say the right things. I hear you. I understand where you're coming from. I get it. I really do. But then, immediately after saying those words, their behavior does not change at all. They continue doing the exact thing that hurt you. They continue holding the same interpretation they held before you spoke. They continue treating you the same way, as if the conversation never happened. This is what psychology calls performative empathy. It is the appearance of understanding without the substance of it. And it is extraordinarily disorienting, because you walk away from the conversation feeling like something happened, like a shift occurred, like you were finally heard. And then, 3 days later, you realize nothing changed. And you wonder if you explained yourself clearly enough. So you try again. Go deeper. Give more context. Expose more of yourself, and the cycle repeats. Here is what the human mind does not naturally want to accept. Some people have learned to perform understanding as a way to end conversations, not to continue growth. They say, "I hear you," to make you stop talking, not because they have actually received what you said. And the tragic irony is this: the more emotionally intelligent you are, the more vulnerable you are to this particular pattern, because you naturally assume that other people process emotions the way you do, that when someone says they understand, they mean it the way you would mean it. They do not. Always watch behavior, not words. Behavior is the only honest language. If someone claims to understand you and then continues to behave in a way that contradicts that understanding, they have told you everything you need to know. Your explanation did not fail. Their willingness to change was never there. Pay close attention here, because this is one of the most insidious dynamics that exists in human relationships. Healthy relationships operate on a simple, unspoken agreement. You feel what you feel. I feel what I feel. We may not always understand each other's feelings, but we do not demand that the other person justify their existence, but certain people operate differently. With these people, your feelings are always on trial. Why would you even feel that way? That doesn't make any sense. You shouldn't feel hurt by that. It wasn't a big deal. I don't see why that upset you. Notice what is happening. Your feeling, which is yours, which arose inside your own body and experience, is being submitted for their approval. And their approval is the thing that determines whether your feeling is valid or not. This is not a relationship. This is a courtroom. And in this courtroom, you are always the defendant. I want you to think about someone in your life. Maybe it is someone you are thinking of right now. Someone whose response to your pain is always a cross-examination. Someone who makes you feel like you need evidence to support the fact that you were hurt. With that person, no explanation will ever be enough, because the goal is not to understand your feelings. The goal is to remain in the position of judge over them. And the moment you understand that, the exhaustion you have been carrying starts to make sense. You were not failing to communicate clearly. You were trying to win a verdict that was never going to be delivered in your favor. Silence reveals everything. Stop presenting your case. Close the file. Walk out of the courtroom. Your feelings do not require a verdict from anyone. This is the final sign. And in many ways, it is the most important. Here is how it works. You gather your courage. You organize your thoughts. You speak clearly, calmly, and directly. You explain how you feel, what you need, where the boundary is. And instead of acknowledgement, instead of a real response to what you actually said, they respond with something completely unrelated. They bring up something from 3 months ago. They shift the topic to something you did wrong. They become suddenly vague when they were previously clear. They respond to a conversation you were not having. This is called topic flooding in psychology, and it is used, consciously or not, to ensure that your clarity never lands, that your directness never gets a direct response, that every time you try to create solid ground in the conversation, new confusion is introduced to make you lose your footing. The result is that you spend the next hour or the next day trying to address all the new topics that appeared, while your original point disappears entirely, buried under the flood. and you leave the conversation feeling more confused than when you entered it, wondering how the discussion about your feelings turned into a referendum on your entire character. This is not a communication failure. This is a tactic, whether they know it or not. And your explanation, no matter how careful, will always be met with more chaos, because chaos is the environment in which your voice loses its power. The antidote is not a better explanation. The antidote is the one thing that chaos cannot survive: stillness. Silence reveals everything. Here is something nobody prepares you for. The moment you stop explaining yourself to the wrong people, it feels uncomfortable at first. Not peaceful, not empowering. Uncomfortable. Because most of us were taught from childhood that silence is guilt. That if you have nothing to hide, you explain. That good people justify themselves. That walking away from an accusation means the accusation was true. We were taught that explanation equals integrity, but that is only true when the person receiving your explanation is operating in good faith. When they are not, explanation does not equal integrity. It equals surrender. There was a woman I want to tell you about. I will call her Nadia. Nadia was one of the most self-aware people I have ever encountered. She read, she reflected, she worked on herself constantly. She was deeply committed to being honest in her relationships, and she had a sister. Older, charming in public, quietly critical in private. For 15 years, Nadia explained herself to this sister. Every life decision became a conversation. Every boundary became a negotiation. Oh, every feeling Nadia expressed was met with a reframing that made Nadia sound like the unreasonable one. Nadia would spend hours preparing for family dinners, rehearsing how she would respond to the questions she knew were coming, crafting careful, measured answers that could not be twisted. They were always twisted. She told me once, sitting across from me with the kind of exhaustion that lives behind the eyes. She said, "I feel like I have spent 15 years writing letters to someone who reads them upside down." That sentence stayed with me because that is exactly what it is. When you explain yourself to someone who has decided who you are writing letters they will always read upside down. The effort is real, the intention is genuine, but the translation is broken on their end, and not yours. And here is what happened to Nadia. After 15 years, she stopped, not dramatically, not with a speech, not with a final explanation about why she was done explaining. She simply became still. Her sister would make a cutting comment at dinner. Nadia would look at her calmly and say nothing. Her sister would question a decision. Nadia would say, "I've thought it through," and change the subject. Her sister would push. Nadia would not meet the push with force. She would simply not be moved. At first, her sister escalated. The comments got sharper. The questions got more pointed. The pressure increased. This is something you need to understand. And it is critical. When you stop explaining yourself to someone who has relied on your explanations to maintain power over you, where they will escalate before they retreat. Your silence feels threatening to them, because your explanations were never just information. They were a form of submission, a signal that they were still in authority over your narrative. When you stop submitting, they push harder to restore the dynamic they are used to. Do not interpret this escalation as proof that you should start explaining again. Interpret it as confirmation that you were right to stop. Because here is what happened next with Nadia. After several months of this quiet, unmovable stillness, something remarkable occurred. The dynamic shifted completely. Not because her sister changed. She did not. But because Nadia had changed the architecture of their relationship. She had removed the thing her sister's behavior depended upon. which was Nadia's endless willingness to justify herself. Without that, the old dynamic had nothing to stand on. Nadia told me the most surprising thing was what she discovered about herself in that process. She said, "I realized I had been explaining myself for so long that I had started to believe I needed permission to exist the way I am." Read that again. She had been explaining herself for so long that she had started to believe she needed permission to exist the way she was. That is what chronic over-explanation does to a person over time. It quietly, invisibly erodes your belief in your own legitimacy. It trains you to see yourself through the eyes of someone who was never going to see you clearly. It makes you dependent on an approval that was never going to come. And the withdrawal of that dependency, for as uncomfortable as it feels in the beginning, is one of the most profound acts of self-restoration a human being can perform. Silence reveals everything. Let me tell you what happens psychologically when you stop explaining yourself. Most people believe that silence communicates weakness, evasion, guilt, but that is only true in a courtroom. In real human dynamics, prolonged, grounded, undefensive silence communicates something entirely different. It communicates that you do not require their verdict. And that is one of the most powerful signals one human being can send to another. Here is why the human brain is wired to seek resolution. When a conversation is unresolved, the mind keeps pulling toward it, keeps trying to close the loop. This is called the Zeigarnik effect in psychology. Unfinished things occupy mental space far longer than finished things. When you explain yourself, you give the other person resolution. You close the loop for them. They get to process your explanation, confirm or deny it, and move forward with their conclusion intact. But when you stay silent, you give them nothing to close the loop with, and that creates something unexpected. It creates doubt. Not immediately, but over time. The person who was so certain about who you are starts to wonder. Because certainty depends on opposition. It feeds on your defensiveness. It grows stronger every time you try to prove them wrong. Take away the defensiveness, and the certainty starts to crack. This is not manipulation. This is not a game. This is simply understanding how the human mind actually works and refusing to fuel a dynamic that was never built in your favor. Psychology shows that the people who are most respected in any social environment are almost never the ones who explain themselves the most. They are the ones who seem to require no external validation for the truth of who they are. There is a gravitational pull to that kind of person, a quiet authority, a solidity that makes other people lean toward them rather than push against them. You can become that person. Not by pretending you do not feel things, not by becoming cold or emotionally unavailable, but by developing the deep internal understanding that your character does not need a spokesperson. Your life speaks. Your choices speak. Your consistency speaks. Let them speak. Silence reveals everything. I want to give you something practical before we close. A rule. Simple, tested, transformative. It is this. Explain yourself to people who are curious about you. Never explain yourself to people who have already concluded about you. Read that again slowly. Explain yourself to people who are curious about you. Never explain yourself to people who have already concluded about you. How do you tell the difference? Curious people ask questions that create space. Their questions open the conversation outward. They listen, and their face changes as you speak. They update their understanding in real time. After you explain, something shifts between you. A warmth, a recognition, a sense that something real was exchanged. Concluded people ask questions that close space. Their questions are narrow, leading, already pointed toward an answer. They listen and their face stays fixed. Nothing updates. After you explain, you feel as though you spoke into a wall. Because you did. Once you feel the difference, you cannot unfeel it. And once you stop wasting your clarity on people who are never going to receive it, something extraordinary happens. You suddenly have an enormous amount of energy you didn't know you were missing. Energy that was going into preparing explanations, replaying conversations, wondering what you should have said differently, trying to find the perfect combination of words that would finally make someone understand what they had already decided not to understand. That energy comes back to you, and what you do with it, how you redirect it, into your work, your real relationships, on your growth, your peace, that is where your life begins to look fundamentally different. You came into this video carrying something. Maybe it was the memory of a conversation that left you hollow. Maybe it was the exhaustion of a relationship where you always feel like you are on trial. Maybe it was a quiet confusion about why your honest explanations keep making things worse instead of better. And now you know. It was never about your communication. It was never about finding the right words. Some people are not waiting for your explanation. They are waiting for your submission. And the difference between those two things is everything. The 5 people to never explain yourself to are clear now. The ones whose questions are traps. The ones who store your vulnerability like ammunition. The ones who perform understanding without practicing it. The ones who make you earn the right to your own feelings. And the ones who answer your clarity with more confusion. These people exist in every life, in families, in friendships, in workplaces, in relationships. And the wisest thing you can do, the most psychologically sound, the most emotionally healthy, the most quietly powerful response to all of them is the same. Become still. Not cold, not cruel, not dramatic. Still. Let your life be your explanation. Let your consistency be your argument. Let your peace be your proof. Because at the end of it all, the people who truly deserve to understand you will understand you without requiring you to dismantle yourself to be understood. And the people who never intended to understand you will reveal that truth through your silence faster than your explanations ever could. Silence reveals everything. If something in this video landed in a place you have been carrying for a long time, I want you to do one thing. Write in the comments the words, "My silence is my answer." Not as a performance, as a declaration to yourself. A commitment that from this day forward, you will stop filing briefs in courtrooms that were never designed to rule in your favor. And think of one person in your life right now. Someone who has been exhausting you with the weight of always needing to explain yourself to them. You do not need to confront them. You do not need to announce anything. Just quietly, calmly, with full awareness, decide to stop. And watch what their response reveals about who they always were. Silence reveals everything. And now, so do you.